Kykuit. The name alone makes you think of beautiful outdoor spaces, expensive statues, and the quiet, almost holy feeling around what's basically America's version of a royal palace. From this hilltop, you can see the Hudson River sparkling far below, and on clear nights, the lights of New York City in the distance shine like precious gems that the Rockefellers never officially owned as royalty, but controlled through their wealth. Tourists come in groups to walk through perfect gardens, to admire famous sculptures by artists like Henry Moore and Calder, and to look at garages full of shiny old luxury cars like Rolls-Royces and Packards. This is the mansion that oil money built, a symbol of charity, culture, and how American wealth can do good things. But behind the beautiful decorations and glowing windows is a much darker story, one made of oil money, violence, shame, and sadness that no tour guide will ever fully tell you about. The stone walls of Kykuit have witnessed not only garden parties and charitable announcements, but the aftermath of massacres, the terror of kidnapping threats, the suffocating weight of expectation, and family tragedies that no fortune could prevent. Long before the first stone was laid on this hill, there was a boy staring at columns of numbers in a little red ledger he called Ledger A, quietly deciding that he would never again be powerless. By the time the Supreme Court tore his empire apart, John D. Rockefeller Sr. was both the richest man alive and the most hated man in America. That hatred drove the family to retreat above the world, to a quiet hill in Westchester, where they could control the view, the gates, and the story itself. The first house on the property burned in 1902, and they saw the flames as a gift, a divine permission to start again, bigger, grander, untouchable. They named the new mansion Kykuit, Dutch for lookout. This would not merely be a house, it would be a carefully constructed facade, a stage set where the Rockefellers could rewrite their image and, they hoped, their souls. From the outside, it looked like paradise, but paradises are often built to keep something out or to keep something in. From the outside, the Rockefellers looked like America's royal family. Inside Kykuit, the children were raised with one message carved into every corridor, every routine, every glance from their parents. This wealth is a burden you must spend your life justifying. Kykuit was more than a home. It was a shield built high and far away, while the consequences of that wealth burned on the other side of the country. But what if the very foundations of this mansion were laid upon secrets, compromises, and a hidden history that even the most diligent biographers have struggled to uncover? Kykuit, a name now synonymous with enlightened philanthropy, is more than an estate. It is a repository of memory, a silent observer of the rise and the terrible cost of power, a keeper of shadows that have shaped the destiny of a dynasty. What if the immaculate lawns, the priceless collections, the carefully rehearsed tours are merely a veneer concealing a narrative far more complex, far more unsettling than the official story? This hill, with its commanding presence, has stood as a symbol of success and redemption for over a century. Yet behind its stone walls, within its 70 miles of private roads, a different drama has unfolded, one marked by human frailty, ruthless ambition, and private anguish. Each generation of Rockefellers has left its imprint on Kykuit, not just in marble fountains and underground galleries, but in unspoken guilt, in stifled grief, in the knowledge that some stains cannot be landscaped away. The walls have absorbed the whispers of desperate meetings after Ludlow, the hushed telephone calls about a son missing in New Guinea, the silent dinners after another branch of the family tree snapped in a car crash just beyond the gates. Every foundation, every museum, every university that bears the Rockefeller name has been accompanied by its own undercurrent of tension, atonement, and compromise. Kykuit has been a stage for both public triumph and private torment, a place where the boundaries between generosity and guilt, between duty and despair, have repeatedly blurred. But what has Kykuit truly witnessed? What untold stories lie buried beneath its terraces, woven into the very fabric of its existence? What secrets have its stones absorbed, and what shadows still linger in its galleries after the tourists have gone home? The answers are not easily found, Kykuit, by its very nature, is a place of discretion and control. Its inhabitants have always understood the necessity of protecting the family image, of maintaining the myth of benevolence even in the face of scandal, outrage, and unspeakable loss. The records that do exist, the letters, the diaries, the meticulously edited memoirs, tell only part of the story. They are carefully curated, polished, filtered through layers of public relations and family protocol. The true narrative of Kykuit, the one that captures the full spectrum from triumph to tragedy, remains elusive, pieced together from fragments, from whispers, from the things no tour guide will ever mention. To understand the full story of Kykuit, we must journey back to its origins, to the era before the hill was a fortress, when it was merely farmland and forest, owned by people who never imagined they were sitting on the future sanctuary of America's most controversial dynasty. But even before that, we must understand the man who made it all possible, the boy with the ledger who became the richest man in human history. John Davison Rockefeller was born in 1839 in upstate New York to a father who was often absent, a traveling salesman of dubious patent medicines and even more dubious morals. William Avery Rockefeller, known as Devil Bill to some, was a bigamist, a con man, and an absence that shaped his son more profoundly than any presence could have. Young John learned early that the world was unreliable, that security came only from discipline and accumulation, that every penny must be accounted for. At 16, he took his first job as an assistant bookkeeper, and every transaction he recorded in a small red ledger he would keep for the rest of his life. Ledger A became his Bible, his proof that order could be imposed on chaos, that numbers never lied even when people did. When oil was discovered in Titusville, Pennsylvania in 1859, the world went mad. Prospectors flooded the region, derricks sprouted like weeds, fortunes were made overnight and lost by morning. It was the California gold rush all over again. But this time, the treasure was black and slick and burned with a clean, bright flame that could light the world. Rockefeller, barely 20, saw the chaos and understood something others did not. The real money was not in drilling but in refining, not in the gamble of the well, but in the certainty of controlling what came after. In 1870, he founded Standard Oil with partners who would soon discover that partnership with John D. Rockefeller meant eventual absorption. He believed competition was wasteful, that the chaos of the marketplace destroyed value, that consolidation was not greed, but rational efficiency. He began buying refineries. When owners refused to sell, he cut prices until they bled money and came to him begging. He negotiated secret deals with railroads. Ship exclusively with us and we will pay you back a portion of every barrel, not just ours, but our competitors as well. It was brilliant. It was ruthless. It was perhaps the most effective exercise in monopoly building in American history. By 1880, Standard Oil controlled roughly 90% of America's refining capacity. Rockefeller had become something no American had been before. A man who controlled an entire industry, who could set prices, who could make or break companies with a telegram. He was meticulous, disciplined, and utterly convinced that what he was doing was not merely legal, but moral. A service to humanity through the elimination of wasteful competition. He attended church every Sunday, taught Bible classes, never drank, never smoked, gave generously to his Baptist congregation. He saw no contradiction between his business practices and his faith. God, he believed, had given him the talent to organize, and organization was what the oil industry desperately needed. But America was changing. The Gilded Age had produced spectacular wealth and spectacular inequality. In the cities, the poor lived in tenements without light or air, while industrialists built marble palaces. In the countryside, farmers watched railroads and grain elevators squeeze them dry, while distant men in distant cities set the prices. A fury was building, a sense that something fundamental had gone wrong, that democracy itself was at stake, when a handful of men controlled the necessities of modern life. And John D. Rockefeller, with his 90% control and his secret railroad rebates, became the face of everything that was wrong. The muckrakers came after him with the ferocity of crusaders. Ida Tarbell, whose father had been driven out of the oil business by Standard's tactics, spent 9 years assembling evidence. Her articles in McClure's magazine were devastating. The bribes, the industrial espionage, the systematic crushing of competitors, the secret deals that violated every principle of fair trade. She portrayed Rockefeller as a spider at the center of a vast web, patient and pitiless, spinning his trap around an entire industry. The country read her work with mounting outrage. Political cartoonists drew him as a bloated octopus, tentacles wrapped around the capital, around workers, around the very throat of democracy. Theodore Roosevelt, who had made trust-busting his signature issue, went after Standard Oil with the full force of the federal government. The case dragged through the courts for years. Standard's lawyers argued that efficiency was not a crime, that consumers had benefited from lower prices, that bigness was simply the natural evolution of modern industry. But in 1911, the Supreme Court ruled against them. The monopoly must be dissolved. Standard Oil would be broken into 34 separate companies, each to compete independently. The decision was front-page news across the country. In the streets, people celebrated as if a tyrant had been overthrown. Rockefeller was 62 years old, technically defeated, universally despised, and, due to the quirks of how the breakup was structured, richer than ever. The stocks he owned in the now independent companies soared in value. At the moment of his greatest public humiliation, his wealth reached perhaps 1% of the entire American economy, a level of personal fortune that would never be matched. He had won and lost simultaneously. He had more money than he could spend in 1,000 lifetimes, and a country that would spit at the mention of his name. In the late 19th century, John D. Rockefeller Sr. began quietly buying parcels of land in Pocantico Hills, using intermediaries so prices would not soar, so attention would not be drawn. Farm after farm, house after house, until thousands of acres belonged to one man who wished to disappear from public hatred. This was not simply the purchase of real estate. It was the creation of a private kingdom, a buffer against a nation that had drawn him as an octopus, that had spat his name in newspapers, that had cheered when the Supreme Court broke Standard Oil in 1911. The location was carefully chosen. The hills above Tarrytown offered elevation, privacy, and a commanding view of the Hudson River. From this height, you could see storm systems approaching from the north, ships moving on the water below, the distant towers of Manhattan, the city that had made the family but now threatened them with its crowds, its questions, its uncontrollable fury. Pocantico Hills was close enough to New York to maintain business connections, but far enough to feel like a separate world entirely, a place where gates could be locked and guards posted, and the outside kept firmly outside. The land acquisition took years and required considerable stealth. Rockefeller employed agents who bought property on his behalf, often through shell companies, to prevent sellers from inflating prices when they learned who the real buyer was. Some farmers sold happily, suddenly wealthy beyond their dreams. Others held out, only to find themselves surrounded on all sides by Rockefeller property, their own land now accessible only by roads the family controlled. A few refused entirely and watched as their neighbors left and the estate grew around them like a slowly tightening noose. Eventually, most sold. The ones who did not found themselves living in an increasingly strange situation, private islands in a sea of Rockefeller control. By the early 20th century, the estate encompassed thousands of acres. There were working farms with cattle and crops, miles of carriage roads winding through forests, a private water system, a power plant, tenant housing for the workers who maintained it all. This was not merely a country retreat. This was a self-sufficient domain, a place that could theoretically seal its gates and survive indefinitely. It was what a medieval lord might have built if given modern resources and modern fears. The message was clear. We are no longer subject to your world. We have built our own. The house itself went through multiple incarnations before it became the Kykuit we know today. The first structure was pleasant but modest, a Victorian country house suitable for summer weekends, but hardly the statement the family would eventually require. Then, in 1902, it burned. The fire started in the pre-dawn hours, and by the time the household woke, the upper floors were engulfed. The family escaped unharmed, but the house was destroyed. In their letters afterward, there's little mourning. Instead, there's a sense of opportunity, even relief. Fire purifies, fire erases, fire offers the chance to start again, and this time, to do it properly. John D. Rockefeller Jr., who would become the primary resident of Kykuit, hired Chester Aldrich and William Delano to design a replacement. The architects produced a handsome Georgian revival mansion, elegant and understated, exactly the sort of house a cultivated family might build. Junior rejected it. It was not grand enough. It did not convey the proper gravitas. If the family was going to build a house that would stand for generations, that would represent not just wealth, but legitimacy, culture, and permanence, then it needed to look the part. A country house was no longer sufficient. What was needed was a villa, a palazzo, a structure that would announce to the world, we are no longer vulgar oil barons scrambling for profit. We are patrons of civilization itself. William Wells Bosworth was brought in to transform the structure. Bosworth had just finished designing the campus of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and understood how to use classical architecture to convey institutional authority. He wrapped the existing house in stone, added colonnades and balustrades, laid out terraces in the French formal style, created vistas that stretched from the house to carefully placed temples and sculpture gardens, and finally to the river itself. Everything was calculated for maximum effect. The approach to the house took visitors through winding roads, past manicured landscapes, building anticipation. The entrance was designed to impress without overwhelming. The interiors combined comfort with grandeur, a place where you could live but also receive ambassadors, host heads of state, negotiate the future of continents. The gardens became an obsession. Thousands of trees were planted, many already mature and transported at enormous expense. Formal terraces descended in careful progression from the house, each level a separate garden room with its own character, its own plantings, its own sculptures. There were reflecting pools where the sky doubled itself. There were classical temples overlooking the river. There were fountains imported from Italy and gates rescued from demolished European estates. Landscape architects were hired, fired, hired again until every sightline was perfect, until you could stand anywhere on the property and the view would be composed like a painting. Bosworth understood that what he was building was not just a home, but a narrative. Every element of Kykuit was designed to tell a story. We have learned from Europe's great houses, we have absorbed its culture, we are now its equals and perhaps its heirs. The classical references, the Italian gardens, the French terraces, all of it was meant to say that the Rockefellers were not robber barons, but cultivated inheritors of Western civilization's highest traditions. If you could surround yourself with enough beauty, enough history, enough carefully curated culture, perhaps the ugliness of how the money was made would fade into irrelevance. Abby Aldrich Rockefeller, Jr.'s wife, brought a different kind of courage to Kykuit. While the architecture looked backward to classical models, Abby looked forward. She was one of the first great collectors of modern art in America, buying Picasso and Matisse and Braque when most of her social circle considered them incomprehensible or obscene. She filled the house with color and controversy, hung abstract paintings in rooms designed for old masters, placed African sculptures on classical pedestals. Her taste was daring, her eye was excellent, and her commitment to modernism was absolute. In 1929, she helped found the Museum of Modern Art in New York, ensuring that the Rockefeller name would be associated not just with Standard Oil and industrial philanthropy, but with the cutting edge of contemporary culture. Kykuit became a private museum, the rooms filled with acquisitions that grew more valuable with every passing decade. Later, Nelson Rockefeller, the third of Junior's sons, would take this even further. He dug underground galleries beneath the house, climate-controlled spaces where hundreds more works could be displayed. He collected compulsively Picasso ceramics, Calder mobiles, Henry Moore bronzes, indigenous art from around the world. The collection eventually numbered in the thousands of pieces, many of them museum-quality works that under other circumstances would have been in public institutions. Instead, they lived here, in private galleries beneath a private mansion, seen only by family and invited guests. This was the paradox of Kykuit. It was built to impress the public, to rehabilitate the family image, to demonstrate culture and cultivation. But it remained stubbornly private, accessible only to those with invitations, those who passed through multiple security checkpoints, those who understood they were being granted a privilege that could be revoked at any moment. The beauty was real. The art was magnificent. But it was beauty deployed as strategy, art collected as armor against a hostile world. On the 20th of April 1914, the telephones began ringing at Kykuit with news from Colorado. The headlines the next morning were brutal. Ludlow massacre. Women and children burned alive. Rockefeller owned the mines. Rockefeller was responsible. For weeks, the estate was under siege by reporters. Junior, pale and shaking, read the accounts and for the first time truly understood what his inheritance meant. He would spend the rest of his life trying to outrun those flames. The Colorado coal mines had been in turmoil for months. The miners, many of them immigrants who spoke little English, worked in conditions of shocking danger and exploitation. The mines were controlled by the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company, which was in turn controlled by the Rockefellers. The company owned not just the mines, but the towns around them, the houses the miners rented, the stores where they bought food, the very ground beneath their feet. Wages were paid in scrip that could only be spent at company stores where prices were inflated. Safety conditions were minimal. Accidents were common. When miners were killed, widows were evicted from company housing to make room for the next worker. In September 1913, the miners went on strike. They demanded union recognition, better pay, enforcement of safety laws, the right to shop in independent stores, the right to live in housing not controlled by the company. The company refused every demand. Miners and their families were evicted from company housing and set up tent colonies in the hills. Winter came, and conditions in the tents became desperate. Women cooked over open fires. Children shivered through mountain nights. The company hired guards, many of them thugs and strikebreakers imported from other states, and armed them with rifles and machine guns. Tensions escalated through the winter and into the spring. On April 20th, Greek Easter and the beginning of Passover, shooting began. Accounts differ as to who fired first, but once it started, it did not stop. The guards and company militiamen surrounded the largest tent colony at Ludlow. Machine guns were positioned on hills overlooking the camp. The miners, armed with hunting rifles and whatever else they could find, fired back. The battle lasted all day. As evening approached, someone, witnesses said the militiamen, the company said it was accidental, set fire to the tents. The miners and their families had dug pits beneath the tents, crude storm cellars where they had sheltered during previous shooting. As the tents burned, people ran for these pits. In one pit beneath a burning tent, rescue workers the next day found the bodies of 2 women and 11 children. They had suffocated as fire consumed the oxygen above them. The youngest victim was 3 months old. The images went around the world, tiny bodies laid out in a row, the blackened remains of the tent colony, militiamen posing with rifles beside the ruins. For John D. Rockefeller, Jr., this was the nightmare made flesh. He had inherited the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company from his father. He had approved the company's hard line against the Union. He had authorized the hiring of strikebreakers. He had never visited the mines, had never seen the conditions, had relied entirely on reports from managers who had every incentive to minimize problems and maximize profits. Now, children were dead, and his name was on every angry banner, every furious editorial, every cartoon showing workers crushed beneath the heel of capital. The public reaction was immediate and savage. In New York, there were protests outside the Rockefeller offices at 26 Broadway. Crowds chanted for Jr. to be prosecuted for murder. Anarchists plotted to bomb the building. 3 of them died when their device exploded prematurely in a tenement on Lexington Avenue. Across the country, labor unions called for boycotts of any business with Rockefeller connections. Ministers preached sermons comparing the family to Pharaoh, to Herod, to every biblical villain who had shed innocent blood. Editorial writers called for the nationalization of the coal industry, for the prosecution of the Rockefeller directors, for revolution itself, if that was what it took to prevent such horrors from happening again. At Kykuit, the family entered a state of siege. Guards were posted at every gate, visitors were screened, mail was checked for explosives. Junior stopped going to the office in Manhattan and conducted business from the estate. His health, never robust, deteriorated. He suffered from insomnia, digestive problems, crushing anxiety. His wife, Abby, watched him grow gaunt and haunted. His father, now in his 70s and nominally retired, maintained a facade of unconcern, but privately worried that everything they had built was about to collapse. The legal aftermath dragged on for years. No one was ever successfully prosecuted for the deaths at Ludlow. The company blamed the union. The union blamed the company. Investigations were launched and quietly buried. A congressional hearing turned into political theater, with both sides claiming vindication. But the court of public opinion had rendered its verdict. The Rockefellers were guilty. The name that had already been synonymous with monopoly and greed was now also synonymous with murder. Junior understood that something fundamental had to change. The family could not simply weather this storm as they had weathered previous criticism. The bodies of those children made this different. This was not an abstract debate about market competition or antitrust law. This was blood and fire and grief, and no amount of denial would make it disappear. The family needed a new strategy. They needed to transform not just their public image, but perhaps even themselves. This was when Ivy Lee entered the story. Lee was one of the pioneers of modern public relations, a man who understood that in the 20th century, reputation could be managed, perception could be shaped, narratives could be controlled. He advised Junior to do something radical: go to Colorado, meet with the miners, be photographed with them, show the world that you care, that you are not the heartless villain of the cartoons, but a human being who wants to make things right. Junior, who had never been comfortable with public attention, who had been raised to believe that gentlemen did not explain themselves, reluctantly agreed. In September 1915, more than a year after the massacre, John D. Rockefeller Jr. arrived in Colorado. What followed was a carefully orchestrated campaign of image rehabilitation. Jr. toured the mines, descending into the shafts, asking questions about working conditions. He ate with miners in their mess halls. He attended dances in company towns and awkwardly attempted to dance with miners' wives while photographers captured every moment. He gave speeches about the dignity of labor and the need for better understanding between capital and workers. He announced the Rockefeller Plan, a system of company unions and employee representation that fell short of recognizing independent unions, but offered more than the miners had ever had before. The photographs went around the world. Here was the young Rockefeller, sleeves rolled up, hard hat on, standing among working men. Here, he was sharing a meal, shaking hands, listening with apparent concern. The press coverage, much of it influenced by Lee's careful media management, began to shift. Perhaps this tragedy had transformed the Rockefellers. Perhaps they had learned something. Perhaps redemption was possible. Back at Kykuit, the campaign of atonement accelerated. The money that had been accumulating for decades began pouring out in unprecedented amounts. Universities received endowments. Medical research facilities were funded. Public health campaigns were launched. The eradication of hookworm in the American South, the founding of the University of Chicago, the restoration of colonial Williamsburg, the preservation of historic sites in Europe. All of it was funded by Rockefeller money. All of it was carefully publicized. All of it was designed to say, we are not robber barons, but benefactors, not villains, but visionaries, not the problem, but the solution. And yet for Junior himself, no amount of philanthropy could erase what he had seen in the photographs from Ludlow. Those small bodies, those burned tents, those faces of women who had lost everything. He would carry that weight for the rest of his life, and he would make sure his children carried it too. The message he drilled into them, constantly and relentlessly, was simple. This wealth is not yours to enjoy. It is a burden, a responsibility, a debt that can never be fully repaid. You will spend your lives trying to prove that you deserve what you have inherited. You will never truly succeed, but you must never stop trying. Inside Kykuit, The children grew up in a world unlike anything most Americans could imagine. They lived in a mansion with 40 rooms, surrounded by priceless art, attended by servants who appeared and disappeared like ghosts. But they were not raised to believe they were fortunate. They were raised to believe they were responsible. John D. Rockefeller Jr. was a demanding father, a man who had been crushed by the weight of expectation and was determined that his children would be strong enough to bear it. He gave them allowances measured in pennies and required detailed accounting of every expenditure. They kept ledgers, just as his father had, recording income and spending, demonstrating at every turn that they understood money was not for pleasure but for purpose. Frivolity was discouraged. Self-indulgence was a sin. The message was constant and unrelenting. You are Rockefellers, and that means you do not have the luxury of being ordinary. The 6 children, Abby, John III, Nelson, Lawrence, Winthrop, and David, each responded to this burden differently. Some embraced it, others were crushed by it. All of them spent their lives in the shadow of Kykuit, shaped by its beauty and its demands. Abby, the only daughter, was in some ways the freest, and in other ways the most trapped. As a woman in that era, less was expected of her professionally, but she was expected to marry appropriately, to maintain appearances, to be a credit to the family name. She married well to a man named Babs Milton, and seemed for a time to have found a way to live within the family's expectations while maintaining some space for herself. But the pressure, never truly relented. And her own daughter, Marilyn, would later speak of the suffocating weight of being a Rockefeller woman, of being decorative and dutiful, and never quite enough. John III, the eldest son, took the burden most seriously. He was gentle, thoughtful, deeply committed to the family's philanthropic mission. He believed absolutely in the doctrine his father had taught him, that great wealth demanded great responsibility, that every privilege must be justified through service. He devoted himself to international development, to cultural institutions, to Asia Society and other organizations aimed at improving understanding between nations. He was earnest, hard-working, and by all accounts a good and decent man. And perhaps that is why his death hit the family so hard. On July 2, 1978, John D. Rockefeller III was driving on a country road not far from Kykuit when his car collided with another vehicle. He died at the scene. He was 72 years old, still active, still engaged with the family's vast network of foundations and initiatives. His death felt like a betrayal, a cosmic unfairness. Here was a man who had done everything right, who had sacrificed personal ambition for family duty, who had lived exactly as he had been taught to live, and he had died suddenly on an ordinary road on an ordinary afternoon, and all his goodness had not protected him. The family gathered at Kykuit for the funeral, and the grief was profound. If someone like John could not be safe, if even obedience and service offered no protection, then what was any of this for? Nelson was the opposite of John in almost every way. Where John was cautious, Nelson was bold. Where John was self-effacing, Nelson was ambitious. Where John found meaning in quiet service, Nelson wanted the world stage. He became governor of New York, served as vice president under Gerald Ford, and spent decades trying and failing to become president. He was charismatic, energetic, and utterly convinced that Rockefeller wealth could and should be deployed to shape national and international policy. Nelson transformed Kykuit into a showcase for his art collection, building those underground galleries and filling them with hundreds of pieces. He used the estate for political entertaining, hosting governors and senators and foreign dignitaries, turning his family home into an unofficial headquarters for his political ambitions. He was married 3 times, a scandal in an era when divorce was still considered evidence of moral failure, but he never let propriety stand in the way of what he wanted. In this, he was more like his grandfather than his father, a man who believed that greatness justified almost anything. But Nelson, too, paid a price. His presidential ambitions were never realized. He spent millions on campaigns that went nowhere. He died suddenly in 1979, officially of a heart attack in his Manhattan townhouse, though rumors persisted that the circumstances were more complicated, more embarrassing than the family wanted to admit. He was 70 years old, and still grasping for the presidency that had eluded him. In the end, not even a Rockefeller could buy the White House. Lawrence found his purpose in conservation and venture capital, funding environmental causes and early technology companies. Winthrop fled to Arkansas, as far from Kykuit's shadow as he could manage, and became governor there, trying to build an identity separate from the family name. David became a banker, chairman of Chase Manhattan, a figure in international finance and diplomacy, perhaps the most successful at navigating the peculiar challenges of being both a Rockefeller and an individual. But for all their achievements, all their efforts to live up to the family's expectations or escape them or redefine them entirely, they remained prisoners of Kykuit in ways they could never quite articulate. The estate was home, but it was also a cage. It represented everything they had been given and everything they owed. It was beautiful and suffocating in equal measure. Of all the tragedies that touched Kykuit, perhaps none captured the public imagination quite like the disappearance of Michael Rockefeller. Michael was Nelson's son, born into spectacular privilege but restless, curious, drawn to adventure in ways that made him uncomfortable with the marble halls of the family estate. After graduating from Harvard, he joined a friend on an anthropological expedition to New Guinea, seeking primitive art and authentic experience far from the choreographed life of an American dynasty. In November 1961, Michael and his companion were traveling by boat along the coast of Netherlands, New Guinea, when their craft capsized. His companion was rescued. Michael decided to swim for shore, a distance of several miles through shark-infested waters. He was never seen again. The search that followed was massive. Nelson pulled every string available to him, mobilizing the Dutch colonial government, the military, private planes, boats, search parties. For weeks, the coastline was scoured. Villages were questioned. But Michael had vanished as completely as if the jungle had swallowed him whole. The official conclusion was drowning. But rumors persisted. The region where Michael disappeared was home to the Asmat people, who had only recently given up headhunting and cannibalism under pressure from colonial authorities. Some said Michael had made it to shore and been killed by tribesmen who did not know or did not care who the Rockefellers were. Some said his skull was kept as a trophy in a village no outsider would ever reach. Some said he had been ritually consumed, that a Rockefeller had literally been devoured by the primitive world he had been seeking. Nelson never publicly accepted that his son was dead. For years he funded expeditions, followed leads, pursued rumors. He kept Michael's room at Kykuit exactly as it had been. He spoke of his son in the present tense, as if Michael might walk through the door at any moment with stories of his adventures. The not knowing was in some ways worse than confirmation of death. At least, death offered closure, offered the possibility of grief, and eventually acceptance. This was something else, an open wound, a question that could never be answered. At Kykuit, Michael's absence became one more ghost in the galleries, one more shadow the guided tours would not mention. The estate that was supposed to protect the family from the dangerous world had failed. The wealth that was supposed to ensure safety had been meaningless. Michael had fled the prison of privilege and found something worse, an oblivion so complete that even Rockefeller money and power could not illuminate it. In later years, researchers would investigate further, gathering testimony from Asmat villagers, assembling a case that Michael had indeed made it to shore and had been killed, his body treated according to local tradition. But this remained conjecture, rumor, stories told decades after the fact by people who had their own reasons for telling or not telling what they knew. The mystery remains, and perhaps that is fitting. Michael wanted to escape the carefully controlled narrative of Kykuit, to find something raw and real. He found it, and it swallowed him whole, and even the most powerful family in America could not bring him back or even discover what really happened. Some tragedies announce themselves with headlines and search parties. Others happen quietly in closed garages with engines running, and the family works very hard to keep them quiet. Winifred Rockefeller Emeny was Junior's niece, a woman who had grown up adjacent to the main branch of the family, close enough to know the expectations, but perhaps not quite secure enough in her place to bear their weight. The details of Winifred's life remain deliberately obscure, protected by family discretion and the passage of time. What is known is this: she married, had children, and struggled with the particular burden of being a Rockefeller woman in an era that offered few outlets for ambition or identity beyond marriage and motherhood. She was not free to pursue a career with the intensity her male cousins could. She was not able to throw herself into building foundations or running for office. She was expected to be decorative, dutiful, appropriate, and somewhere in that narrowing corridor of expectations, something broke. On a day that the family has never publicly discussed, Winifred went to the garage. She took her 2 daughters with her. She started the car. Carbon monoxide is an invisible killer, odorless and efficient. By the time they were found, it was far too late. A mother and her children, dead in a garage on an estate that had been built to keep danger out, that had walls and gates and guards and 70 miles of private roads, none of which could protect against the despair that grew from within. The family's response was silence. There was no press release, no public statement, no acknowledgement that this had happened. The deaths were recorded quietly in family records and then buried even more quietly in family memory. This was not the sort of story that fit the narrative of enlightened philanthropy and public service. This suggested something darker, that the weight of being a Rockefeller could be not just burdensome, but lethal, that the prison of privilege could drive someone to choose death not just for herself, but for her children. For years afterward, no one spoke of it. Family gatherings continued at Kykuit. Children played on the same lawns. Guests admired the same art. But those who knew carried the knowledge with them, a secret shadow in the sunlit rooms. What kind of desperation leads a mother to that choice? What kind of isolation? What kind of trapped feeling? What kind of absolute absence of hope? And what does it say about Kykuit, about the family, about the entire carefully constructed world they had built, that this could happen here, in the very heart of their sanctuary? The guided tours that would eventually open to the public would never mention Winifred. Visitors would walk through gardens she had walked through, past garages she had known, and they would hear stories of art and architecture and philanthropy. They would not hear about carbon monoxide or desperation, or the possibility that privilege could be its own kind of death sentence. Some stories, the family decided, would remain forever private. Some shadows would never be brought into the light. After the Lindbergh baby was kidnapped and murdered in 1932, every wealthy family in America reassessed their security. But for the Rockefellers, who were already the most visible target of public resentment, the threat felt especially acute. Kykuit transformed from a private estate into something closer to a fortress. The guards multiplied. Every entrance to the property was manned around the clock. Visitors were photographed, their license plates recorded, their identities verified against lists. Delivery trucks were searched. Even mail was screened for potential threats. The family's movements were carefully planned and coordinated. The children were driven to school in cars with reinforced bodies and bulletproof glass. Bodyguards, discreet but omnipresent, accompanied them everywhere. This was life in a gilded cage. The children of Kykuit grew up understanding that they could not simply wander out the gate and explore the neighborhood the way other children might. They could not attend public schools or play in public parks without elaborate security arrangements. They learned early that being a Rockefeller meant being both special and trapped, elevated and imprisoned by the same circumstances. The security extended beyond physical protection. The family employed people whose job was to monitor newspapers, to track any mention of the Kykuit Rockefeller name, to be alert for potential threats or scandals. Private investigators were kept on retainer. Lawyers stood ready to sue for libel or injunction. The family had learned from Ludlow and from decades of hostile press that their reputation required constant vigilance, constant management, constant defense. Inside the estate, life tried to maintain a facade of normalcy. There were family dinners and holiday celebrations, tennis matches and swimming in the pool, horseback riding along those 70 miles of private roads. But the normalcy was always shadowed by awareness. Guards stood watch, gates remained locked. The world beyond the walls was treated not as a place to explore, but as a potential threat to be monitored and controlled. This siege mentality shaped the psychology of generations. The children learned to be gracious to outsiders while never fully trusting them. They learned to present carefully curated versions of themselves to the public, to understand that every word they spoke might end up in a newspaper, that every action could reflect on the family name. They learned to live in a state of perpetual performance, always aware that they were Rockefellers first and individuals second. Some adapted to this better than others. David, the youngest, seemed most comfortable with the role, moving through the world with the quiet confidence of someone who had made peace with his circumstances. Others chafed against it, sought escape in geographic distance or alcohol or marriages that scandalized the family. But none of them could truly escape. Kykuit had marked them, shaped them, made them who they were. The fortress that was meant to protect them had also imprisoned them, and there was no key that could unlock those particular chains. If Kykuit was built as a fortress against public hatred, the art collection was its most sophisticated defense. Here was proof that the Rockefellers were not merely wealthy but cultured, not just powerful but discerning, not destroyers but preservers of civilization's highest achievements. Every painting, every sculpture, every carefully chosen piece was a statement. We are not who you think we are. We are better than our worst moments. Abby Aldrich Rockefeller pioneered this strategy. In an era when abstract art was considered incomprehensible or even dangerous, when respectable society collectors bought only traditional works by dead European masters, Abby bought Picasso and Matisse. She bought Braque when his paintings looked like shattered glass. She bought African masks when they were considered primitive curiosities. Her eye was extraordinary, and her courage was greater. She understood that art was not just decoration, but a claim to cultural authority. A way of saying that the Rockefeller family was not just of the past, but of the future. The house filled with modernist works. In rooms designed for classical repose, bright explosions of color announced that this was not your grandfather's mansion. Abby was making a statement. The Rockefellers could afford to take risks, to be ahead of the curve, to champion artists who would eventually be recognized as the most important of the 20th century. When she helped found the Museum of Modern Art in 1929, she ensured that the Rockefeller name would be forever linked with artistic innovation rather than industrial exploitation. Nelson took this impulse and expanded it to near-obsessive levels. He collected compulsively, buying hundreds of works, traveling the world in search of art that excited him. The underground galleries he built beneath Kykuit became a private museum that rivaled many public institutions. There were entire rooms devoted to Picasso ceramics. There were Calder mobiles suspended from specially engineered ceilings. There were Henry Moore bronzes arranged in the gardens like sentinels. There were ancient textiles and pre-Columbian sculptures and folk art from around the globe. The collection was eclectic, ambitious, sometimes brilliant, and sometimes merely expensive. But all of it served a purpose beyond aesthetic pleasure. It said, "We are patrons, not parasites. We support artists, preserve cultures, protect beauty from destruction." The money that came from crushing competitors and negotiating secret railroad rebates was now buying immortality of a different kind. The Rockefellers might not be loved, but they would be respected for their taste, their generosity to museums, their role in making modern art accessible to the public. Yet there was something troubling about art collected as strategic redemption. Did a Picasso erase the memory of Ludlow? Did a Moore sculpture compensate for the miners who died in Colorado? Could beauty purchased with tainted money ever be truly clean? These were questions the family preferred not to ask and certainly not to answer publicly. The art spoke for itself, they would say. Its presence at Kykuit demonstrated values that transcended the circumstances of its acquisition. But the contradiction remained. The same fortune that could buy masterworks had been built on practices that destroyed lives. The same family that championed artists who challenged convention demanded absolute conformity from their own children. The galleries beneath Kykuit held treasures that millions of people would never see, beauty locked away behind the same walls that kept the dangerous world at bay. The democratizing impulse that led to MoMA's founding existed in tension with the hoarding impulse that kept so much art private, visible only to those with invitations, those who belonged to the approved circles. Walking through those underground galleries today, surrounded by works worth hundreds of millions of dollars, it is hard not to feel the weight of that contradiction. The art is magnificent. The collecting impulse was genuine, but it was also calculated, strategic, part of a larger campaign to transform the family's image from robber barons to beneficent patrons. Beauty was deployed as a weapon in a public relations war, and like all weapons, it served the purposes of those who wielded it. The paintings could not speak. The sculptures offered no commentary on the hands that had purchased them or the history that had made such purchases possible. They simply existed, beautiful and silent, in galleries carved from the hill where a dynasty had chosen to make its stand. For decades, Kykuit remained what it had always been, a private sanctuary, inaccessible to anyone without an invitation, a world unto itself where the rules were made by the family and no outsider could challenge them. The gates stayed locked. The guards remained at their posts. The tours were private, for dignitaries and donors, carefully controlled presentations that showed only what the family wanted shown. But dynasties do not last forever. The generation that had built Kykuit died. Their children aged. The grandchildren and great-grandchildren scattered across the country and the world, pursuing their own lives, less tied to the estate and its traditions. Maintaining Kykuit became increasingly expensive and increasingly complicated. The art collection alone required climate control, security, conservation. The gardens needed constant attention, the roads had to be maintained, the infrastructure of a small kingdom required resources and commitment, and as the family's center of gravity shifted away from the estate, questions arose about its future. In the 1980s, discussions began about what to do with Kykuit. It could be sold, broken up, the art dispersed to museums, the land developed or donated as a park. But that felt like betrayal, an admission that everything the family had built was temporary, disposable, just another piece of real estate to be liquidated when convenient. Another option was to maintain it privately, to continue pouring money into its upkeep, but for what purpose? To be a museum that only family members visited seemed wasteful. To be a residence for whichever branch of the family wanted it seemed inadequate to its historical significance. The solution they settled on was to make Kykuit public, or at least semi-public. The estate and its contents would be donated to the National Trust for Historic Preservation. Public tours would be offered, but carefully controlled. Visitors would arrive on shuttles, would be guided through specific routes, would see what the family decided they should see. It would no longer be private, but it would not be truly public either. It would occupy a middle space, accessible but controlled, open but regulated, a museum that still bore the marks of its origins as a fortress. In 1994, the first public tours began. Suddenly, people who had spent their lives reading about the Rockefellers, who had only imagined what their private world might look like, could buy tickets and see for themselves. They walked through the same rooms where presidents had dined. They stood on terraces where major policy decisions had been debated. They saw the art that had been locked away for decades. For many visitors, it was thrilling, a glimpse behind the curtain, a chance to see how American royalty had actually lived. But the tours were carefully choreographed. Certain rooms remained off limits, certain stories were emphasized while others were never mentioned. The guide spoke of Junior's restoration of colonial Williamsburg, of Nelson's governorship, of the family's environmental work and philanthropic foundations. They spoke of the art collection and the gardens and the architectural significance of the house itself. They mentioned that the estate had been created as a private retreat, but rarely explained what the family was retreating from or why such elaborate security had been necessary. Ludlow was mentioned, if at all, in passing. Winifred was not mentioned at all. Michael Rockefeller's disappearance might be noted as a family tragedy, but the rumors of cannibalism, the desperate searches, the obsessive refusal to accept his death, these were not part of the official narrative. The tours showed a sanitized version of the family history, the triumphs without the full weight of the tragedies, the beauty without the blood. This was perhaps inevitable. No family wants their worst moments to be the focus of public tours through their ancestral home. But it meant that visitors left with an incomplete picture, seeing Kykuit as a monument to enlightened wealth and public service, without fully understanding the darker currents that had shaped its existence. They saw the mansion on the hill, but not the mines in Colorado. They saw the gardens, but not the graves. They saw the stage set, but not the shadows backstage. As the 20th century ended and the 21st began, the Rockefeller family faced questions that would have been unimaginable to the dynasty's founder. The fortune, once the largest in human history, had been divided and subdivided through generations. The name still carried weight, still opened doors, still connected its bearers to a network of power and influence that most Americans could never access. But the family was no longer what it had been. The empire had fragmented. The center had not held. The later generations of Rockefellers faced the peculiar challenge of inheriting a name more famous than they would ever be. They were born into wealth, but not the stratospheric wealth of their great-grandfather. They carried a legacy of both philanthropy and exploitation, and they had to navigate how to honor the former while acknowledging the latter. Some devoted themselves to continuing the family's charitable work. Others pursued their own paths in business or politics or the arts. Some changed their names, seeking escape from the burden of expectation. The question of what it meant to be a Rockefeller in the modern era was never satisfactorily answered. The family foundations continued their work, giving away billions over the decades to universities, medical research, environmental causes, the arts. The family name appeared on buildings and endowed chairs and entire institutions. But the visceral connection between the name and the oil empire that had created it faded over time. Standard Oil had been broken up in 1911. Its successor companies, Exxon, Mobil, Chevron, and others, became independent entities. The Rockefeller family no longer controlled them. The fortune that had been built on petroleum became diversified across countless investments, managed by professional advisors, disconnected from any single industry. This diffusion of power and identity created a strange kind of displacement. The later Rockefellers were wealthy by any normal standard, but not wealthy by the standard of the modern billionaire class. They were famous, but often only because of their name, rather than their individual achievements. They were connected to history, but increasingly distant from the events that had made that history so dramatic. They were, in a sense, living in the long shadow of Kykuit, beneficiaries of its legacy, but also prisoners of its mythology. Some of them tried to reconcile the family's history with modern sensibilities. They supported environmental causes, acknowledging the irony that the fortune had been built on fossil fuels. They funded research into renewable energy. They supported indigenous rights movements. They tried, in various ways, to make amends for the aspects of the family history that were hardest to defend. Whether these efforts constituted genuine atonement or merely sophisticated public relations remained a matter of interpretation. Others simply tried to live their lives as normally as possible, to the extent that anyone named Rockefeller could live normally. They pursued careers, raised families, made their own mistakes and achievements. They tried to be individuals rather than representatives of a dynasty. Some succeeded better than others. The name remained both a gift and a curse, opening doors but also inviting scrutiny, providing resources but also imposing expectations. At family gatherings at Kykuit, which continued periodically even after the estate became semi-public, there must have been a strange quality to the reunions. These were people bound together by blood and name, but scattered across different cities, different careers, different understandings of what their shared heritage meant. They gathered in rooms where their great-grandparents had wrestled with the consequences of Ludlow. They walked gardens where Nelson had displayed his art and planned his presidential campaigns. They looked out over the same Hudson that John D. Rockefeller Sr. had once gazed upon, seeking peace after a nation had declared him its enemy. Did they feel the weight of it all? Did the ghosts speak to them? Or had enough time passed, enough generations accumulated, that Kykuit was simply a beautiful old house, historically significant but emotionally distant? There is no single answer. Each Rockefeller carried their inheritance differently. Each made their own accommodation with the past. As the 21st century advanced, Kykuit remained frozen in time, a monument to an era that was simultaneously recent and impossibly distant. The house looks much as it did in the mid-20th century, when Nelson was at the height of his power and the family name still meant something visceral to most Americans. The art is still there, protected in those underground galleries. The gardens are still immaculate, maintained by a staff that continues the tradition of excellence that William Wells Bosworth established a century ago. The views are still commanding, the Hudson still glittering in the distance, the Palisades still standing sentinel across the water. But the world around Kykuit has changed beyond recognition. The Standard Oil monopoly that financed everything has been broken and broken again. The successor companies operate in a world where petroleum is increasingly understood not as a miraculous source of wealth and progress, but as an existential threat to the planet's climate. The industrial capitalism that John D. Rockefeller pioneered has been replaced by digital capitalism, where the great fortunes are made not in oil refineries, but in social media algorithms and cloud computing. The Rockefeller name, while still recognized, has been eclipsed by new dynasties: the Gates family, the Bezos fortune, the Musk empire. In this context, Kykuit can feel like a relic, a beautifully preserved artifact from an age that is past. The tours continue, the visitors still come, but what are they really seeing? Are they witnessing history or merely consuming nostalgia? Are they learning about the complexity of American wealth and power? Or are they being sold a carefully sanitized version that makes them feel good about the system that produced such spectacular inequality? The guides at Kykuit are knowledgeable and professional. They speak of the family's achievements with genuine respect. They describe the art with enthusiasm and expertise. They point out architectural details and landscape features that demonstrate the care and expense that went into creating this place. They are doing their jobs well. But their job is not to make visitors uncomfortable. Their job is not to dwell on the children burned at Ludlow, or the desperation that drove Winifred to her garage, or the possibility that Michael Rockefeller's skull might still sit in a village hut in Indonesia. Their job is to present Kykuit as a triumph, a story of American success, a demonstration of what can be achieved when great wealth is combined with cultural sophistication and philanthropic commitment. And there is truth in that narrative. The Rockefeller family did give away vast sums. They did support causes and institutions that made genuine contributions to human welfare. The University of Chicago is a real place that has educated generations of students. The medical research they funded has saved real lives. Colonial Williamsburg, whatever you think of its historical interpretation, has preserved buildings and stories that would otherwise have been lost. The Museum of Modern Art has brought art to millions who would never otherwise have encountered it. These are real achievements that cannot be dismissed, but they exist in tension with the other truth, that the money came from somewhere, that the methods used to accumulate it destroyed lives and communities, that even the most generous philanthropy cannot fully compensate for the harm done in wealth's accumulation. This tension is what makes Kykuit fascinating and troubling in equal measure. It is why the estate cannot be understood as either simple villain's lair or simple monument to virtue. It is both and neither, a place where American contradictions are literally built into the landscape. Standing on the great terrace as the sun sets, watching the light fade from gold to purple over the Hudson, it is possible to feel all of this at once. The beauty is real. The tragedy is real. The ambition was real, and so was the suffering it caused. The philanthropy was genuine, and so was the guilt that motivated it. The family's desire for redemption was sincere, and so was their determination to control their own narrative. None of these truths cancels the others out. They coexist, layered like the stone and soil of the estate itself, impossible to fully separate or reconcile. In recent years, Kykuit has taken on new meanings as American attitudes toward wealth and inequality have shifted. In an era when income disparity has reached levels not seen since the Gilded Age, when billionaires build private space programs while millions struggle with medical debt, the story of the Rockefellers feels simultaneously historical and contemporary. The mechanisms of wealth accumulation have changed, but the basic dynamics remain. The concentration of resources in few hands, the power this gives over society, the question of whether anyone should be allowed to become that rich, the debate over whether philanthropy can justify or compensate for the methods used to acquire wealth. Kykuit has appeared in films and documentaries, in architecture journals and histories of American art. It has been analyzed by scholars of the Gilded Age, by students of philanthropy, by critics of capitalism, by admirers of landscape design. Each brings their own perspective, their own understanding of what the estate represents. For some, it is evidence of what is best about America, the possibility of transformation, the power of individuals to make a difference, the creation of beauty and support for culture. For others, it is evidence of what is worst, the legitimization of ill-gotten wealth through strategic giving, the creation of dynasties that undermine democratic equality, the ability of the rich to buy, not just things but reputation, legacy, history itself. The truth, as always, is more complicated than either simple reading allows. Kykuit is not just a symbol, it is a real place with a real history, built by real people who were neither saints nor demons, but humans navigating impossible contradictions. They were trying to do good with money obtained through means they themselves sometimes recognized as problematic. They were trying to raise children who would be worthy of their inheritance while knowing that no one could ever truly earn such wealth. They were trying to buy redemption, security, meaning, purpose, and they succeeded partially and failed partially, and the estate they left behind reflects all of it. As night falls on Kykuit now, the windows of the house glow warm and golden against the darkness, and the illusion is almost perfect. Almost. The estate looks like what it was meant to look like, a place of beauty, culture, sophistication, and quiet power. The tours have ended for the day. The visitors have returned to their cars and driven back to their lives. The staff has dimmed the lights and locked the doors. The security systems that replaced the human guards of earlier eras have been activated. The house settles into silence. But if you stand very still on the great terrace, if you let the wind off the Hudson carry away the noise of distant traffic, if you allow yourself to truly listen, you can still hear them. The faint crackle of burning tents in Colorado, the muffled cough of exhaust in a closed garage, the distant endless surf of a cannibal coast, the whispered conversations of children being told that their privilege is actually a burden they must spend their lives justifying, the quiet desperation of a man who accumulated the greatest fortune in human history and discovered that no amount of money could make him loved. These sounds are not literal. They are not audible to recording equipment or physical ears. They are the sounds history makes when it refuses to be buried, when the official narrative cannot quite contain all the truth, when beauty and horror share the same foundation. They are what makes Kykuit more than just another mansion preserved as a museum. They are what makes it a haunted place, not in the supernatural sense, but in the deeper sense of being inhabited by unresolved questions, unreconciled contradictions, unavoidable truths about power and wealth and the American dream. This is the dark story of Kykuit, the most powerful family mansion America ever produced. A sanctuary built from the profits of oil and the ruthless elimination of competition. A fortress against public anger that could never quite keep the anger from seeping in. A training ground for a dynasty of philanthropists who gave away billions and still could not escape the shadow of how those billions were made. A silent witness to tragedies that no amount of money could prevent and that no amount of discretion could fully hide. School books, they are benefactors. In documentaries, they are titans. In museum tours, they are enlightened patrons who supported art and preserved history. But here on this hill, if you look carefully and listen closely, you feel the full complexity. The generosity that was real and the guilt that motivated it, the beauty that was genuine and the blood money that purchased it, the children raised to believe they must justify their existence and the terrible price some of them paid for trying. The empire that was built on the destruction of others and the foundations that tried to make amends. The fortress that was meant to protect the family but became its cage. The legacy that was meant to redeem but can never quite escape what it is redeeming from. Empires fall, fortunes fade. Even the Rockefeller wealth, once equal to 1% of the entire American economy, has been divided and diminished across generations until it is merely large rather than incomprehensible. But the house on the hill remains, stone and steel and glass in carefully tended gardens, holding the story of a family that tried to buy redemption, tried to transform themselves from robber barons into benefactors, tried to use wealth to create meaning and beauty and lasting good. They succeeded more than most, they failed more visibly than most. And the estate they left behind stands as monument to both the success and the failure, beautiful and troubling, inspiring and haunting, a place where American contradictions are preserved in amber and offered up for anyone with a ticket and the willingness to look beyond the official tour. The shadows remain. They always will. Some stains go too deep ever to be landscaped away, no matter how many gardens you plant, no matter how many museums you endow, no matter how many generations pass. Kykuit knows this. The stones remember. The walls hold secrets that the guided tours will never reveal. And as long as the house stands on its hill above the Hudson, it will continue to tell both stories, the one the family wanted told, and the one that refuses to remain silent.